Good afternoon, my friends. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can be with you forever. And make sure to turn in tomorrow for my Warrior Dungeon Synth album live stream. I will probably be going about starting at like 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If not, then I'll post updates to see when I will be starting off with this album. So today I'm going to be talking about a subject that has been on my mind recently, and that's the subject of, toxic femininity versus toxic masculinity. Right? These are two concepts that have been circulating around in social discussions. Particularly toxic masculinity is a concept that's become very prevalent in recent years with this whole Me Too movement that's been going around. And I want to touch base on it because I think within this binary system of the gender representations that exhibit themselves based off of biological gender, or even within people who are transitioning as well, people who are biologically male who exhibit a lot of feminine characteristics and can be toxically feminine in that sense, and also women who can be very masculine and exhibit toxic masculine traits as well. So, this isn't a talk where I'm going to be talking specifically about your biological gender, although I think that factor has a lot to do with a lot of the mentalities that arise from being masculine or feminine. But everyone's different, so there's always going to be outliers. But I'm going to be talking about masculine and feminine in those kinds of contexts. So, starting off, let's just get to the obvious one of toxic masculinity. What is toxic masculinity? Well, it's the masculine energy. If you want to think about what is masculine and what is feminine, take a look at the biological physical hormones that exist in all humans, and that's testosterone and estrogen. So if you want to look at what masculinity is, look at what testosterone does to you. And if you want to look at what femininity does, look at what estrogen does to you, right? So it's pretty simple like that. There's not really any reason to overcomplicate things when thinking about this. But when we're looking at masculinity, what are the exhibitions of toxic masculinity that we could see? And that's generally a lack of control with sexual drive and of anger and frustration primarily. When you see a toxic man, they generally have a lack of control in terms of dealing with their anger or their sexuality, right? This is when you get into men who are basically predatory by nature. They objectify women to the point where they feel the need to use women as a sense of conquest sexually. And this is when it exhibits into that toxic mentality where, it harms both the women, obviously, and the men, because the men are, not being able to live their lives in a happy and satisfied way of life. They're constantly needing to hunt and survive. This is very much a survival mentality that's sort of been distorted in a sense to be overly survival, to be overly impulsive, to act upon your base desires and base angers and frustrations. A lot of toxic masculinity resides in very much fixing the present moment. If you're unsatisfied right now, it needs to be solved right now. If someone's bothering you, you need to address that situation as quickly and as effectively and as forcefully as possible. So this comes across as being, overly aggressive, overly impulsive, overly ignorant as well. So toxic masculinity comes in that sense where you need to assert yourself and assert your dominance over everyone. Right? This is very much a survival mentality. That's where toxic masculinity is generally rooted in. And, having to deal with that is being able to balance out that masculinity, being able to harness it. I think what we see a lot in the world is when we look at toxic masculine traits is to let men basically say that masculinity is evil. It should be eradicated. It should be eliminated from their being, so to speak, and it should be subdued or, be made docile, which I don't think is the best way to go about it. it's generally dealing with a lot of energy that's being arisen, especially from a young age, that needs to be channeled effectively. It needs to be controlled. It needs to be effectively distributed into your body so that you're utilizing it for the best of your ability, right? This is the whole point of when you're dealing with this energetic construct, this masculine energy that is within you. You want to be able to control that and utilize it to your best benefit. You don't want to just get rid of it. Everything that is given to you can be used for a proper purpose, a good purpose for you. Having this desire to just eliminate it or get rid of it is very much a Western concept of, eradication medical procedures, right? You have something wrong with you, eradicate it. That's very much, Western medicine is all based around that notion. And that's sort of the theme that's been propping up here, is not necessarily healing the distorted, toxic, masculine mindset. It's about eradicating it. How do we get rid of it? How do we pretend it doesn't exist? This is why you'll find, these male feminists that are on the surface very docile and very like progressive, and then you find them being super weird and creepy when they're starting to date girls and they start taking advantage and manipulating them because they have tried to eliminate it, or they've been put into a situation or an environment where they were told that they had to eliminate this masculinity. So you can't eliminate it, first of all. You're just repressing it down into you until it needs to be represented once more. So, and then that's when you sort of lose control, and that's when you have these toxic male feminist guys who on the surface feel like to exhibit a lot of progressive and, oh, I care about women, I care about your rights, and then they, act really creepy. And then this is the nice guy syndrome, right? That's like class case nice guy syndrome, feeling like they need to be nice, but they still have that toxic mentality that's within them that they haven't dealt with yet. They don't know how to utilize it properly for their best benefit. And this is when it affects other people, specifically women. And this is an issue of toxic masculinity that needs to be addressed. Now let's go into the other side of the equation and look at toxic femininity, right? We are not really talking about this side of the equation, although it does exist a lot, especially in recent years. And again, like I've said, this isn't exhibited primarily by women. It can be men and women. But this toxic femininity exhibits itself in a communal sense, right? Think about things that are generally feminine and estrogen based. This is all about emotional stability, emotional connections, the mammalian brain more so, the connections that you have with other people. When it gets into a toxic mindset, this is when you get people that are overly emotional and overly dramatic, and they overreact to things without actually thinking about things rationally, right? So this kind of borders on the toxic masculinity as well, because toxic masculinity exhibits itself as anger and dominance, whereas toxic femininity arises from, self-deprecation, victimhood, victimization, feeling like the world is against you, feeling like you want to eradicate and cut people off a lot of the times, right? This is exhibiting in character that can be toxic for yourself and for other people. This is a case where you see this exhibiting in, high school, especially with teenage girls. If you want to see like the dynamic of real masculinity and real femininity in a primal sense and a base desire effect, go to a high school or just think back on high school and see what the social hierarchy was based upon, and look at what the men were doing and look at what the women were doing and how they were exhibiting their characteristics based off of their gender. This is the most base primal instincts that are, being exhibited once we turn like around 14 or 15, and then they start being exhibited within our social circles, and then we sort of grow up and become more civilized, and we're able to control things, hopefully, or we stay in that mindset and we just end up losers. So when you look at it from a female perspective or a feminine perspective, this is very much a case where you see a lot of gossiping about what other people are doing, what they're wearing. Oh, what does she wear? What is she doing? Oh, blah, 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 blah. A little like nitpicking and gossiping and talking shit about other people. When you're looking at guys, there is less of an inclination to gossip more so than to just assert your dominance in a way. This is why when you find in high school, you'll find girls like hang out with guys saying like, "Oh yeah, I love hanging out with guys because there's no drama, there's no gossiping." And that's exactly what guys have. However, they will exhibit the toxic dominance in a different way. It's a much more physical presence. It's a much more physical dominance over other people. With women, it's a much more emotional dominance, right? And this is very much based off of excluding people from the group mentality, excluding you from the group. That's a very feminine aspect of having a group, of having a community, of where everyone can share their emotions and everyone can connect on that way. When you exhibit toxic feminine characteristics, it's when you start excluding people for very superficial reasons, right? Men don't generally, although it's still there, they don't exclude so much as there's more of a general hierarchy that they like to exude, right? There is that sense, but this exists in a feminine circle, so to speak. And this is kind of the gray area where, you know, you have these two poles of difference of masculine and feminine, and where they kind of bridge together, because even on a biological level, both men and women have estrogen and testosterone within them. So, you know, just putting two genders into two distinct groups is kind of not really the point of this. But to illustrate the general directions of these two genders, or these two gender identities, or whatever you want to call it, which way they kind of flow back and forth between each other, is important to recognize, especially as we're seeing a lot of attacks on toxic masculinity. It's good to take a look at what is toxic femininity as well. This is also dealing with, you know, just general, how can I say, there is a tendency of this exclusion factor that bases itself around being petty, being, you know, just judgmental towards other people, especially in the dating community, right? If you want to go on Tinder, these exhibit themselves on a massively distorted scale. You want to see what Tinder is like for men versus Tinder what it is like for women. It's going to be vastly different. It's like insanely different how much the dynamics work. If you're a guy, you're basically coerced into being incredibly thirsty and constantly in that toxic masculine mindset of constantly needing to hunt and constantly needing to like edge your way to like impress a woman, or, you know, try to get her to like you. Basically, you end up really thirsty and really deprived and really depraved of that sexual desires that you have, because there's just so much content. And then women, on the other hand, are just receiving so much influx of men that are just overly sexual, that they kind of can just sit back and just sort of be very petty and sort of feel like they can pick and choose and be very, how can I say, it's a very egotistical mindset on both ends. So there is that element of that exclusion from the group, that you're not good enough because you don't have this quality, blah 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 blah. And when you get into that nitpicky quality of like what makes a good man or what makes a good partner in general, this could come from a man as well. That's a very toxic feminine trait. I recently saw like a tweet from Charlie XCX, who is an artist I'm not really much of a fan of in terms of her persona that she exhibits online. Don't really know her that well in person, but in general, she wrote a tweet on Valentine's Day that just said "ghost him," and that was supposed to be like this clever, funny tweet, basically. That's like, "Ooh, she's so bad. She's such a baddie. Oh my God, get slay, sister." That's like very much toxic femininity. It's very much an exhibition of disrespect towards other people, and feeling like I'm morally superior than you. I am part of the better group of people. I'm part of my own collective group, and that you are excluded from that. When you do shit like that, when you do ghosting and a lot of that, that's a very toxic feminine behavior, which men do that as well. I just want to keep reminding people so that I'm not exhibiting this dualistic mindset that because you're in a certain gender that you don't exhibit these qualities. Everyone exhibits these qualities at some points or another, just that they happen to be more skewed depending on your biological gender, right? So if you're born a woman, you will probably tend to be more feminine. If you're born a man, you will probably tend to be more masculine. But that's different depending on the individual, obviously. So yeah, ghosting, that's a very toxic feminine characteristic that happens a lot nowadays. It's like the feeling that you don't need to put into any effort with other people because they are not worthy of your time or worthy of your attention, even though you have a responsibility to deal with that situation, and you're choosing not to because it's like, it's not my problem, I don't need to deal with it, I'm a queen, I don't need to do anything, blah 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 blah. And that's very much, it's toxic because it's creating this sense of entitlement that you are superior to other people for, just because you exist as a person. It's also just very petty in general. It's also just very lazy on top of that. So those are characteristics, and I kind of want to talk about that because these are dynamics that are going to be affecting people in different ways. And the thing with toxic femininity is that it's a lot more subtle, it's a lot more internal, it's a lot more subconscious, it's a lot more subconscious manipulation. If you think about people who have been in abusive relationships, and this is talking very generally, obviously, because it can sway back and forth depending on your gender. But if you're a woman and you've been in a toxic relationship, most of the time it's going to be a physically abusive relationship. It's the guy being aggressive and angry and yelling at you, or physically abusing you, or raping you, or anything of that nature. When you're a guy and you've been in an abusive relationship, it's most often a mental abuse, right? It's the woman sort of picking holes at you, gaslighting you, making you feel like you're inferior, that you're not worthy of her, that you're not, a real man, so to speak, right? This is very much a toxic feminine behavior of trying to belittle men or belittle your partner in order to feel like they are inferior to your superiority, right? Which is that toxic mindset of trying to bring other people down. But it's done in a very different way because femininity is based around the emotions, based around the subconscious, based around the feelings of how you connect with other people, and the masculine is based more on the physical, the rational, the logical, the aggressive, the sexual, the desire, the burning desire. It's yin and yang, fire and water, whatever you want to call it. That's basically what the dynamics are. And the problem that we get into with discussing these kinds of things that I find with a lot of people is when they try to compare the two and think one is better than the other, which is another toxic mindset to get into. And that's where the toxic femininity or toxic masculinity arises from, is asserting that one side is better than the other, right? If you want to live a balanced life and you want to be a healthy individual, you need to recognize the importance of both sides. And that doesn't mean you need to be a perfect amalgamation of both femininity and masculinity. It just means you need to acknowledge the importance of both. That's really what it all comes down to. Because you might be a more masculine person and you would like to exhibit those qualities more. But that doesn't mean you don't acknowledge the importance of the feminine and what it can bring to you and what it can provide for you. This is where you get into a romantic partnership with someone who exhibits those qualities, and you can blend together in a harmonious relationship. A lot of functional relationships are built this way. A lot of traditional healthy relationships can be built this way. It's when it gets unhealthy, when one side thinks they're better than the other and they start poking holes in the other person to try to belittle them and make them feel inferior to the other person. So, this is that dynamic that I think that is important to recognize, because people are very judgmental towards people. This is very much a westernized concept of comparing two different sides, of thinking one is better than the other. This comes into political discussions as well. This comes into philosophical discussions. This comes into religious discussions. It comes into everything. This constant comparing of everything. Everything is here for a reason. There's no need to compare which one's better than the other, but it's important to recognize the purpose of why these things are here and how we can utilize them, and so that we can create this harmonious balance. Because harmony can exist, however, if the harmony can also be non-existent. It can also be chaotic. It can also be disharmonious. It can also be dystopic, right? And that's the problem with harmony being able to exist, is that because harmony exists, disharmony needs to also exist. And that arises when we start comparing two different sides of masculine and feminine. Which one's better? Which one should we exhibit more? And right now, in pop culture primarily, I'm not talking about in the physical real world scenarios, because it's different once we get into actual people and how actual people are living in the real world. I'm talking specifically from a mainstream pop culture media representation. We're looking at it as a sense that masculinity is bad, femininity is superior, and this is creating toxic mentalities, right? This is where we're starting to see men exhibit toxic masculine behavior because of the fact that they might exist in a world where they're completely indoctrinated by this ideology, where they can actually learn to express their masculinity in a healthy method and a healthy lifestyle. So they end up, becoming alt-right and joining the incel community and becoming toxic in that sense, because they've lost that sense of having a healthy dynamic within understanding their masculinity. And at the same time, they might have been dealing with people who were toxically feminine towards them, and they feel like they need to express toxic masculinity as revenge, so to speak, to overcompensate for the imbalance that exists within their lives. This happens to women a lot as well. There are a lot of women who have been abused by men, and because of that, their relationship with masculinity becomes distorted, so they become very defensive and very aggressive and very you know they become very hating towards masculinity in men, which ironically they become almost masculine in and of themselves. They start representing that because their own relationship with masculinity has been distorted to the point where now they are having to exhibit that toxic masculinity in order for them to sort of feel like they need to even out the playing field, so to speak. Or they could become toxically feminine at the same time. And, because they've been maybe affected by other women in their lives, other women maybe that were more physically attractive than them and made them feel inferior to them and made them feel excluded from the group during high school. So then they grow up and they become a little bit more toxically feminine and start, exhibiting those traits as well. This is the same thing with masculinity as well. You could have been a guy who was bullied a lot in high school and physically beaten up all the time. And then you grow up and you're sort of angry and, you start getting into like fights with people, and you grow up and you start exhibiting those toxic masculine traits because you want to incite revenge, so to speak. A lot of this toxic behavior results in a revenge mentality, right? So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope this was an interesting talk for you. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And make sure to tune in for tomorrow for the Warrior Dungeon Synth album stream that I will be commencing. So keep an eye out for an announcement on that. And with that, I'll see you later. Peace.